Throughout the book of Acts, we see a loosening of the ties between Judaism and Christianity. Stephen began it, and his martyrdom, well, he was the first martyr for this particular issue. And Philip, baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch, took it a little further, and then Peter with Cornelius. And soon the Jewish believers in Jerusalem were very, very suspicious about this new faith being taken to Gentiles. Didn't seem Jewish enough for them. And so finally Paul went up to Jerusalem to challenge the very heart of the church that was sending out these anti-missionaries, as it were, who were saying it's not just enough to believe, you've got to be circumcised as well. And the real issue was not circumcision. Behind that lay the question, should a Gentile become a Jew when they become a Christian? The question of Judaism as such. But behind that was the big issue. And the real issue was salvation itself. Not Judaism or circumcision, but salvation. And the whole question was, is it by works or by faith or a mixture? Now, most religions of the world are salvation by works. You must pray, you must fast, you must give alms, and so on. And then at the end of it all, you'll get right with God. You save yourself by your own efforts. And do-it-yourself religion does appeal to people because it leaves them with their pride. I achieved it. It is self-righteousness. And God hates self-righteousness. He'd rather deal with sin than self-righteousness. Jesus just couldn't get on with self-righteous people. He was a friend of sinners. But the self-righteous, the Pharisees, he couldn't get on with at all. Is salvation by works alone? Do you really have to do your best and really work hard to get there? Or is salvation works plus faith? That's very common. I was a chaplain in the Royal Air Force, and I was the OD chaplain, the odd bod, the other denominations. There was an RC and a C of E, and when a new bunch of men arrived, the C of E would say, how many of you have been christened C of E? And he'd walk off with 70%. Then the RC would take off everybody with an Irish accent, and I would be left. And I was left with Baptists, Methodists, Salvationists, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, agnostics, atheists. Fascinating to be chaplain to atheists, you know. That's another story. But when the men were seated before me, I used to say, how many Methodists and how many Baptists, how many Salvationists? Put their hands up. And in the same tone of voice, and I'd say, how many Christians? Dead silence. Occasionally, a lad would put his hand up and smile. But usually they would go, see if anybody else was. I said, come on, you told me how many Methodists and Baptists. Well, how many Christians? And they used to say, but what do you mean by Christian, Padre? And I said, well, what do you think I mean? And they always said the same thing, someone who keeps the 10 Commandments. Now, I guess they picked that up in church as children, reading them on the wall. But I said, okay, I'll accept that. A Christian is someone who keeps the 10 Commandments. How many Christians are there here? See? And again, there'd be real uncertainty. And then somebody would say, but Padre, you can't keep them all. I would say, well, how many do you have to keep to be a Christian? They always said 6 out of 10. I said, okay, I accept that. A Christian is someone who keeps 6 out of 10 commandments. How many Christians are there here? And it led to a tremendous discussion of what a Christian is. And I made them do the discussion. And this was what they were really struggling with. See, works plus faith says, do as many as you can, and then have faith for what you don't manage. Keep as many commandments as you can, and then ask God to forgive what you didn't manage to keep. That is the most common understanding of Christianity that there is in our country, the do-gooding. Then there are those who say, no, it's faith plus works. You start with faith, and then you go on to works. And you keep the law after you've believed, but you've got to keep the law. See, that's what the Judaizers were saying. Start with faith, and then keep the law. And that's why Paul was going to say to the Galatians, having started in the Spirit, you're going to continue in the flesh. Because law belongs to flesh. That's your effort. It's not the Spirit doing it in you, it's you doing it. And what Paul was fighting for was faith alone. Faith from first to last, as he often puts it. Faith from beginning to end. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God that saves everyone who goes on believing. There's that continuous present again. For it is from faith to faith. Faith from first to last, as the NIV puts it. In other words, we cannot compromise on this. You go on believing. That's the heart of it. You don't believe at the beginning and then work for it. You go on believing. And there's a big difference between telling people they need to go on believing and telling them they need to keep the law now. Huge difference. So this is the real issue that Paul is fighting. What he is fighting for is Christian freedom. To introduce the law at any stage is to put them under a curse. Because the only pass mark that Jesus will accept for the law is 100%. You either keep them all or you've broken the law. And that's true with the traffic laws. If I'm stopped by a speed cop, I can't say, but officer, I stopped at every red light on the way here. He says, I don't care if you stopped at every red light. You have broken the law. And that's what God says, because the law is not just a string of pearls, it's a necklace. Holiness is a complete thing. If you break it at any point, the pearls all fall on the ground. You've broken the law. It doesn't matter if you've broken 1 or 9 or 10. It's like 3 people stranded on a rock in the incoming tide, and there's a 3-meter deep bit of sea now between the rock and the sand, and the first man jumped, and he only managed to jump a third of the way, and he drowned. The second man was a better jumper, and he managed 2/3 the way. He drowned. The third man only missed by 6 inches. But he was lost too. And actually, keeping the law, it doesn't matter whether you managed a bit or a lot. If you didn't make it 100%, you're just as lost as if you broke most of them. That's how God thinks. That's how his word says. Cursed be he who does not continue in all these laws to go on doing them, says the scripture. Now that's the curse you're under if you try and keep the commandments and get to heaven under your own steam. But the gospel has a different way of righteousness altogether. Then, of course, the obvious question is, then why did God give the 10 Commandments? Why did he give the law of Moses at all? And the answer is in Galatians. The answer is, it is by the straight edge of the law that we realize how crooked we are. In other words, it's only the law that tells you you're a sinner. You don't find out how wrong you've been until you study the law of God. Then you discover. It was introduced to prepare us for Christ by showing us that we couldn't keep that law. And that's why preaching the 10 Commandments can bring a person to conviction of sin, because they know there's no way they can keep it, especially the way Jesus reinterpreted those laws.